Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Peter Curtie. I'm one of the research fellows at the Centre for Independent Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's CIS Big Ideas Forum. Well, this evening, our distinguished panel is going to discuss the vast changes in the past century to the delivery of welfare, and the opinions and expectations that surround that delivery. In many parts of the world, including our own lucky country, government welfare has become not just an expected entitlement, but has also fostered something of a mindset. Although the amount of money involved in welfare payments is enormous, amounting to something like 33%, I think, of government spending, it seems that the more that is spent on welfare, the less people are able or willing to provide for themselves. Well, tonight's Big Ideas Forum is concerned with how and why the old belief in dignity through work has been eroded and replaced by an expectation of government handouts without reciprocal responsibility. Our panel members are ready to tell you what they think, so let me introduce them briefly in the order in which they're going to speak. Professor Peter Saunders is a senior fellow at the CIS with a social, is a senior fellow at the CIS with the Social Foundations Programme. Before joining the CIS, Peter was Professor of Sociology at the University of Sussex in England and Research Manager at the Australian Institute of Family Studies. He then joined CIS as Director of Social Policy from 2002 to 2008 and worked mainly on poverty, social inequality and welfare reform. He's published major works on meritocracy, contemporary capitalism, privatization, and home ownership. He returned to England in 2008, which is why I was a little uncertain there of his status, and he now lives in Hastings, where he tells me his runner beans are doing very nicely. The Honourable Gary Johns is Associate Professor of Public Policy at the Australian Catholic University. Gary served in the House of Representatives from 1987 and was Special Minister of State and Assistant Minister for Industrial Relations from 1993 until 1996. He served as an Associate Commissioner of the Commonwealth Productivity Commission from 2002 to 2004 and is President of the Bennelong Society, a society devoted to a rational explanation of Indigenous policy and in particular those challenges in integrating Indigenous people into the mainstream economy. It's a great pleasure to welcome from Canada Chief Commissioner Manny Jules from British Columbia. He's a distinguished First Nation leader and innovator who has devoted over 30 years of his life to First Nation entrepreneurship and self-government. He was elected councillor of Kamloops Indian Band for the first time in 1974, and in 1984 was elected chief. And he served in that capacity with distinction for 16 years until he retired in 2000. Since then, Manny Jules has devoted his time to leading the drive to establish the First Nations fiscal institutions. Professor John Hurst is a widely respected historian and social commentator, a former reader in history at La Trobe University. John has written the official history of Australia for new citizens and also taken a prominent part in the History Summit convened by then Prime Minister John Howard in 2006. John is a member of the Film Australia Board and the National Museum Council. Our fifth speaker is Dr. Jeremy Samet, a research fellow in the Social Foundation Programme at CIS. Jeremy has contributed a number of papers to the CIS Papers in Health and Ageing series and has also written a groundbreaking study of Australia's child protection system, which found that current approaches to assisting dysfunctional welfare-dependent families are putting thousands of vulnerable children at risk of serious harm. Jeremy is published widely in journals and has written for all major newspapers on a range of health and social policy topics. Ladies and gentlemen, those are the members of our panel. Would you please welcome our first speaker, Professor Peter Saunders.
Thank you, Peter. I think our title is Welfare Without the State, isn't it? That's the overarching theme of this evening. And I want to at least kick us off by looking at a very specific welfare state problem, and it's one that in almost every country in the OECD, almost every Western developed country, we've given up on, and we just say, well, the state has got to provide for this through dipping into taxpayers' pockets because we just can't get people to do it for themselves. And what I'm referring to is the problem of child support payments made by men in respect of children that they no longer live with, who are living with a woman that the man is no longer living with. It's a problem, as we'll see right at the end of my presentation, it's a problem that nevertheless there are 2 countries in the OECD which haven't given up on it. And I want to end the talk by just looking at the way in which one, through a rather coercive means, and the other through, I think, a much cleverer means, have been emphasising the importance of individual and family responsibility as an alternative to dipping into taxpayers' pockets to solve even this really quite difficult problem. And the reason it's a difficult problem is that many of the men that we're talking about are themselves on welfare. So what we're looking at, the real crunch problem, is what do you do about a woman who's raising children and is living on benefits, and the father of those children is also living on benefits or has a very low income? How do you get the man to fulfill the financial responsibility which he owes to the woman and her children? And there are 2 countries, as I say, in the world that seem to be able to do it, while the rest of us, including Australia and Britain, have given up on it. So that's the context. Let me just give you a little bit of background to the child support issue. Interestingly, the government has been legislating on this problem for more than 400 years. The first laws in England governing child support arrangements date back to the 1570s. And basically what Parliament said at that time was that a man who is found to have fathered children for whom, outside of the marriage, should be held responsible for looking after them financially, but that where, for whatever reason, there was a shortfall in the amount of money going to the mother with the children, then the parish at that time, the state, would make up the shortfall. And that was essentially the system which stayed in place for the next 400 years. I mean, it changed, obviously, over time, but essentially the system in Britain and indeed in Australia was a court-driven system. The courts would say, yes, you are the man, you owe a responsibility to these children, you've got to pay so much, but if there was a shortfall, the state would make up the shortfall. The problem came in the 20th century when the welfare state started getting bigger and bigger, because predictably the men started paying less and less, and the state started paying more and more. So by the time in Britain that Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979, we had a situation where more than 3/4 of single mothers were reliant on welfare benefits for their income, and of that 3/4, only 22% got any payment at all in respect to their children from the fathers of those children. So most men were paying nothing and the taxpayers were paying everything. Now Thatcher, who if nothing else was a conviction politician driven by a keen sense of her notion of what is right and what is wrong, what is moral and what is bad, thought that this was immoral and unfair and wrong, and pushed strongly for a change in the system, which eventually came, and indeed Australia changed at around the same time too, away from a court system where the courts could have all this discretion about, well, the man hasn't got much money, so we won't ask him for very much and the taxpayer picks up the difference, to a system, a bureaucratic system, establishing a new agency in both Australia and Britain called the Child Support Agency. The idea being that the Child Support Agency as a public bureaucracy, rule-governed, would have clear criteria which would be applied in every case, so that all these men who weren't paying anything would now be expected to pay something, and the agency would chase them to make sure they did. And that's what started to happen. The problem was that chasing a large number of men who have very little income to get them to contribute some child support, which they couldn't really afford, became extremely expensive and inefficient. And within a few years, reports were coming in saying this child support agency is a complete hopeless case, that of every pound the child support agency in Britain was collecting from fathers, more than 50 pence was going in administrative costs, and less than 50 pence was actually being passed on to the children. And what's happened, without going into detail, is over the last 10, 15 years, basically we've given up. It was too difficult, it was too expensive, it was too inefficient, and we've basically said, okay, we will now chase men who have money, but we won't bother chasing the men who don't, which anybody who's familiar with the notion of moral hazard will recognise as a classic moral hazard problem. The best example of that moral hazard problem in the flesh is my favourite Scotsman, a man called Jamie Cumming, who at the tender age of 34, living in Dundee, has managed to produce 15 different children with 12 different mothers, and 2 more are on the way. Indeed, this was at the end of last year, so those 2 more on the way have probably appeared by now. He was named by the British press as Britain's most feckless father. If you think that's appalling, what's really appalling is that Jamie pays a maximum of £5 a week, which is less than a packet of cigarettes, towards the upkeep of his 15 children, because that's all he's required to pay, because Jamie, of course, is himself on benefits. Now, this clearly is unsatisfactory, and I just want to pause for a couple of minutes and step back from this specific issue of child support and think about why it's unsatisfactory. And in discussion we can pick this up more if you like, but I'm used to, and I guess you're used to, the idea that the welfare state is an ethical system. It's a moral system because it provides help and assistance for vulnerable people who need help. And I think that's right. I think it is a moral system. There is a moral requirement on us in a society like this that if somebody is in need of help, in a sense, no matter why, if somebody's in need of help, you can't just cut them off and leave them alone. You've got to be some collective response to try and ensure that they're on their feet again, particularly if there's children involved. And I think that's right. The trouble is that's normally where the argument stops. People say, welfare state, moral system, the morality is, help those who are less fortunate, help the vulnerable. That's the ethic. But there's a second ethic, which I think very often has been forgotten in discussions of welfare policy. And the second ethic is the ethic of fairness, that it's not just that we should help those who are vulnerable, but the way we help them should be fair. And I think that we've increasingly forgotten that. Now, I can talk more about fairness in discussion if you like, but let me cut to the quick, because I know Peter said he's going to make some peace sign at me when I've got 2 minutes left, but he hasn't done it yet. But what would a fair welfare system look like? What are the basic rules and criteria of a fair welfare system? I take for granted that we're going to look after the vulnerable. That's a compassionate welfare system. What about this second morality of a fair welfare system? How do you do it fairly? And I think there are 3 rules. There may be others, but there's 3 that I can think of. The first rule, which the Victorians were well aware of, which in Victorian Britain was, when they reformed the Poor Law, they called it the principle of less eligibility. The first basic rule is that if you're in receipt of public assistance, you should not find yourself in an enviable position relative to those who are paying for it. And that means both financially, you should not be better off on benefits than you would be if you were working. And that might sound a simple principle, but it's actually incredibly difficult to engineer that in a modern complex welfare system, to ensure that every extra hour of work you do makes you better off. In the Australian system in particular, something I've banged my head against the wall for years about in the Australian system, because of tight means testing and targeting, you've got a really severe problem of what the economists call effective marginal tax rates as people move from welfare into work, of trying to ensure they get rewarded properly for doing so. So, less eligibility, this first rule is you should be better off working always than you are on benefits. But also part of that is time-wise, you should not be better off on benefits than you are working. And that's the moral case for work fair, mutual obligation, work for the dole, whatever you want to call it. A lot of people have done a lot of research on this in Australia and in other countries and have shown that work fair type arrangements, training schemes, all this sort of stuff, doesn't seem to do an awful lot of good for the people who go through those schemes. And therefore, people say, therefore, we shouldn't be doing them. Which is completely to misunderstand the point of them. Even if they do no good at all, I mean, hopefully they do, but even if they do no good at all for the people who are going through those schemes, the point of them is to ensure that you're doing something in return for your benefits, because the people at work who are paying for those benefits are giving up their time. Therefore, you should give up yours. Basic moral principle. The second moral principle is the principle of discrimination. It seems to me to be fair that if somebody has been contributing for years through their taxes, through their work, and they lose their job, that they should be treated differently from somebody who has contributed almost nothing and comes along and needs support and assistance. We should discriminate according to the input that people have made. I think we should also discriminate in terms of what has brought people to the situation where they need our help. I give the example I went on the ABC, the drum thing, and we got very bogged down in this about deserving and undeserving poor. But I give the example of drug addicts. That somebody in Britain, there are 76,000 people on the equivalent of the disability pension who cannot work because of self-inflicted drug abuse. I'm not saying they should not be helped, they should be helped, but the way in which they're helped should be conditional on you've got to go through these programs to get off these drugs because you've got to make yourself employable. Whereas somebody else with a different kind of disability, you might well say, I'm quite happy to give you an unconditional benefit, you need support. So we need to discriminate, that's the second rule. And the third rule, which is going to bring me back to the case of Jamie Cumming and child support. The third rule is a rule of personal responsibility and or familial responsibility. It's the rule that before you ask strangers for help, you should exhaust the possibilities in your own life to sorting out your own problems. Let me bring you back to the case of childcare to show you how that might be done. As I said earlier, in most Western countries, we assume that somebody who's got very little money can't fulfill his financial responsibilities to his children, therefore the taxpayer has to do it. There are two exceptions. One is the United States. In Australia, the most that you pay in child support, if you're on benefits yourself, is about, in UK pounds, I think is about £10 a month. In Britain, it's about £20 a month. In America, it's about £120 a month. It's 5 or 6 times more that you're expected to pay. Now, how do the Americans do it? The answer is that it's a court-based system. It's not an administrative system. There's no equivalent to a child support agency. They still go through the courts. And the courts are under instruction to say, when a man comes before them and they assess child support, that we will assume that you are in a minimum wage job for 40 hours a week. And that is the basis on which we're going to assess your child support. And the guy says, but hang on, Your Honour, I don't have a job. And the judge says, well, get one. And in many states says, actually, we've got a work program going here. I direct you to join that work program. Now, there's no reason why Australia and Britain shouldn't do something similar to that. We've got work programs, we've got work for the dole, we've got mutual aid. There's no reason why we shouldn't say, rather than the taxpayer is going to pay your child support because you don't have any money, that we will direct you into a work program with a view to you getting into employment within a very short period so that you can pay your responsibilities. It's a coercive system, but it's a just one, I would argue. Much more interesting, though, coming from left field, is Germany, which is the other exception. And Germany, under its civil code, has a principle which they call solidarity of the generations. It's written into the German Civil Code, section 1601, those of you who read German. And the solidarity of the generations says children, parents, and grandparents owe obligations to each other before the state owes obligations to them. Children, parents, and grandparents. So in Germany, if a man says, sorry, can't pay, haven't got any money, I'm on benefits, they say, well, in that case, we'll go to your parents. Now, and in Germany, the child support that that person £20 per month in Britain, £10 a month in Australia, £120 a month in America, £140 a month in Germany is the expectation that that person would be paying in child support. That, it seems to me, is a fair welfare system. And it's more than that, though. It's interesting because what it does is it gives the family, no, I'm stopping now, it gives the family a role that politicians, particularly politicians on the right, perpetually talk about. We want to strengthen the role of the family. The family is enormously important, but they don't do anything about it. It's rhetoric. And the way in which you strengthen the family is you give it responsibilities. I think if we had that family solidarity rule in Britain and my son cleared off and wasn't paying his child support and the government came to me and said, well, sorry, you know, your son's not paying, you've got to pay. The first thing I'd do, I'd be round his house. Saying, you've got to go and get a job. We've got to sort this out. Come on, how are we going to do this? Because I'm not paying your child support. You've got to pay it. So, you know, to mobilise that kind of informal family network strength to solve a social problem, which in the rest of the world, outside of America and Germany, we think is insoluble. We think the state has to do it because it's just too difficult to sort out. So we need a little bit of lateral thinking. We need to learn from the Yanks. We need to learn from the Germans. And I think that the lesson on child support is a lesson that could be broadened out to a whole range of welfare policies about the use of the family and the insistence on the principle of personal responsibility. Let me finish by quoting Jamie Cummings' mother when the press caught up with her, Britain's most feckless father. And Jamie Cummings' mother said, I give up. It's humiliating to me that the son I raised is not doing his duty in raising his own kids. Well, easy words. Under the German system, she'd have to put her money where her mouth is. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree completely with the notion of fathers' obligations, and so do my two daughters when and if they ever have children. So I agree with that, Peter. Now, I want to make 6 points. One is the position that I take on the concept of the welfare state, which is that the size of the welfare state is a matter of choice. And I'll make 2 observations. One is I see reinstitutionalisation occurring in the welfare sector as a means of handling people and overcoming that sort of rather romantic idea of decades past that we could pay for everyone to live in the community through various means of support. The second observation I would have is that I think governments ought to have more realistic goals, that is, to acknowledge that they cannot solve all problems. In addition to that, there are 3 particular challenges that I think face the welfare state. First is that there is a group of people whose skills will probably always be insufficient in a highly technological society. We have to work out what to do with and for those people. Secondly, there is a declining ratio of work life to retirement life, which may outrun our ability to pay what we'd like to be paid in retirement. And third is another race, the race between the health professions and technologists' ability to keep us alive and our ability to pay for those new technologies. Now, as to the size of the welfare state, I've listened and been lectured to for many years, particularly by political scientists who always tell me what a wonderful welfare state the Swedes have, and that they pay high marginal rates of tax and that they have wonderful revision and so on and so forth. And I'm meant to agree that this is a good thing. And my answer has always been, that's a matter for the Swedes. If the Swedes want to act collectively, tax themselves highly, and then redistribute those taxes in all sorts of benefits, that really is a matter for them. But by and large, Australians don't choose that path. So I want to pick up two qualifications, if you like, to my general observation that the size of the welfare state is a democratically determined thing. The size of the welfare state will tend to be larger than you really want, even in the most democratic of countries. And that's, of course, because voters want government services and they want someone else to pay for them. And politicians want votes. So politicians will, of course, use your money to buy your vote. So there will tend to be an overshoot in welfare states where, if money is originally sourced or raised to help poor people, and people perhaps in the middle class, we might call them, a little further up the rung, get a bit edgy and a bit jealous, they'll want some money as well. So, if you like, the permission for raising funds to help the poor usually is that you're seen to help the middle class, hence some overshoot. So, whilst I think it's a perfectly democratic thing for people to choose the welfare state that they think is good, it's almost certain that we'll get a larger welfare state than you would actually choose because of this buying of votes problem. The second thing, of course, is that in a welfare state there are disincentives to work issues. So if you're paying someone, there's a risk that they may not work. They may not produce the effort that would otherwise be the case if they weren't receiving a benefit. So with those two provisos or qualifications to the welfare state being a matter of choice, I'd have to conclude that it's essential that we have very strong obligations attached to all payments. So our unemployment benefits, our disability support benefits, payments, family payments and so on and so forth must always have strong obligations attached to them and also be heavily means tested. I mean, you do try to keep alive the notion that this is for people who need assistance. And the other great benefit in doing that, strong obligations and tough testing, is that you'll tend to keep your tax compliance amongst all taxpayers higher. Australia has good tax compliance, the Greeks do not. So the Greeks fool themselves into thinking they have a generous welfare system, but they also cheat like blazes by not paying their taxes, and we know the result. So strong obligations, very important. And I must say a little note, our next heroic step down the path of the welfare state is the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which both parties promised to introduce. Now, if you read the Productivity Commission's extensive report on this, they only talk in general terms that a person who is deemed to be disabled shall have a right to sit down and talk to an officer about their needs. But it doesn't tell you what the officer decides, whether they should have 4 hours of care a day or 18 hours of care a day. So there's a potential here not only as to how we define disability and who will get in and not get into the scheme, but how big is the present that each receives. And we've heard already, I think it was from the Auditor General just in days past, that the initial Productivity Commission costs of an extra $6 or $7 billion a year for the NDIS may well in fact be $10 billion a year. So my plea to both sides in the National Disability Insurance Scheme debate is certainly go ahead with some trials and work this thing through very carefully for a number of years before you even pretend to open it up, because both sides haven't got the money to pay for it right now. The second thing is I observe something which I think is rather a good thing, that there was a hope, especially for people, say, with intellectual disabilities and drug dependency and so on and so forth, that people should come out of institutions and be supported in the community. And that has worked for some, those who only need a light level of care, but it has been disastrous for others. And always the welfare sector will say, you haven't paid enough for the care. Now, it is possible that there is no amount of money that will enable a person to live independently in the community. So we're seeing some reinstitutionalisation occurring. There's a thing called a FOIA model of looking after youths at risk, which is really a hostel. It's not pretending anymore that the kid will live in a home and have a normal life. Kids are being reinstitutionalised in a much less, fortunately, oppressive institution than was once the case. They have to be there all the time unless they're at school, and they have lots of lessons and training and so on and so forth. And I think we might see better results there, that, let's call them benign institutions, may be a better choice and a better way of giving a child especially a way through than a pretense that all will be well if each person has their own social worker or whatever. The other thing too is that I think governments should have more realistic goals. Now, my example here is that a recent Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, said that he would like to halve homelessness in Australia, so he set a goal. Now, fortunately, the Australian Bureau of Statistics has revamped its statistics on homelessness, and in fact they were half what we already thought. So well done, Kevin, you've solved the problem. Nevertheless, the problem remains for those who are homeless. Now, it's impossible for there to be a home available on call for every kid who runs away from home tonight, or for every woman who runs from a husband who wants to continue to beat her, or for every person on drugs, or for every person with a mental disability who or is unwell and simply can't stay in the place they are. You can't have 10,000 homes sitting empty, ready for those people. If you did, it would act as an inducement for someone to move into them. So we must distinguish between the level of homelessness and things that can be done for the homeless. Distinguish between a stock and a flow. And I don't think it's possible, although we can improve things, to turn off the flow of homelessness, because we can't solve all the problems of families. These will, by and large, continue. They may get worse in times of high unemployment and a little better in times of low unemployment, but they won't stop. So the measure of how well as a nation I think we handle homelessness is whether services, appropriate services, are available to a person at pretty short call, so that you can get the kid off the street, so the woman has a refuge to go to, and so on and so forth. But for all the money that was spent from the early 1990s on, and there was a huge increase in monies available for homelessness, the rate of homelessness has moved very little, which I think tends to suggest the TAP analogy is pretty right. We can't stop the causes of homelessness, but we can address some of the needs of the homeless. The trouble is there that sometimes we get some shifting. The ABS has been able to tell us that the number of people who are staying with friends and families dropped off as our funding for home and community care rose. So we tended to take people away from friends and family, which the ABS categorised as a form of homelessness. I would have thought that would be relying on friends and family, and shifted them over to government paid for institutions. So there was some shifting going on. So important that politicians are able to convince and talk to an electorate about distinguish between things that can't be done from those that can be done, and for the can be done, what are the best things to do. One other note there is if there is persistence in homelessness among one group, say Aborigines in remote areas, you know you're getting it wrong. So it's time to address the problem in a different way. Fourth thing about there being, well, probably a large number of people who won't acquire the skills required in this society. So my brother-in-law's a wholesaling milk vendor. He hates full employment because at full employment levels he cannot get a bloke to drive a truck and deliver heavy crates to milk bars at 4 o'clock in the morning. So he has to get, make do with friends and family almost and his own sore back. So he's not a fan of full employment. But it reminds us that there are people who have poor skills, some because they're stuck in the welfare trap, but some because they're just not up to it. So we must at all times make sure that the labour market is very free, by which I mean you can buy labour cheaply, so that at least a person has the chance to get in to the labour market. And then you can look after a person's income by other means, transfer payments and so on. And we've tried to move down that path, but to deny a person a chance to get into the labour market, which is the best form of welfare, really is a very cruel thing to do. Next, that other challenge of the declining ratio of work years to retirement years. When my dear old dad was born in 1903, sort of would have started work when he was 15. He actually worked till he was 75. So if I could add up, that's a lot of years in between. What's that, about 60 years? And he actually lived a number of years after. But there was a time in a previous generation when you worked most of your life and then once you retired, you didn't stay with us all that much longer. Now, of course, it's possible to work 30 years and be retired 30 years. So the ratios change massively. Fortunately, our incomes are rising, but nevertheless, it may well outpace our ability for people to be paid for in their retirement by the next generation of taxpayers. So politicians will have to lift the age at which people can get access to the age pension, or be pretty creative about making sure people work on part-time and continue to contribute to their own. And that really shouldn't be a difficult thing to do. And last, but by no means least, of course, is the cost of health. Here again is another race. Medical technology is enabling us to live a great deal longer, and as our incomes rise, we can more or less pay for that, but some won't be able to. And there's no reason why technological innovation won't in fact outrun our ability to pay for those things. So what to do about that? I think the key thing for me here is to make sure that everyone knows the true cost of what it is that keeps them alive. So when they go to the doctor, they get the full account. With Medicare, subsidy to you is as follows. They go to a public hospital, they get an account with the subsidy written in, but so that they understand the true cost. I remember as an MP talking to a dear old digger who was, I might say, complaining somewhat that he wasn't being looked after enough. This is in Brisbane, right? So I questioned him about what it was that he wasn't being sufficiently cared for, and he said, well, they've had me in a Sydney hospital for weeks when they've done this and that and the other. We worked out that it was probably about $1 million spent on his health, but he wasn't happy. Well, he probably didn't realise the real cost of all of those extraordinary things that were happening to him. So I lobbied at that time for a very simple thing, that the true cost of heart tablets should be put on to the label and then the subsidy written in. I couldn't work out why it was we couldn't do that. I failed to get it done in Parliament. Peter reminded me over the weekend that it probably was a deal between the Commonwealth and pharmaceutical companies. The Commonwealth was able to bid down the price at which the Commonwealth buys some of these pharmaceuticals that doesn't allow them to put the real price on the label. Nevertheless, the proposition has to get up at some time, that you need to be able to tell people, even if only by way of softening up the electorate, if you like, of the true cost of their medicine. And a little addition to that is the notion that we should never allow people to forget how much contribution they are making. This is not to blame, but the fact that, and it's been the desire of many governments to lift the tax-free threshold to take people out of the tax system, and the government has announced lifting the tax-free threshold to, I think, about $18,000 and taking a couple of million Australians out of the system. Whilst it has its merits, and there are other arguments as to why we do this, we're really saying to 2 million Australians, well, you don't have to make a contribution. I'd rather they got an account at the end of the year that had some sort of notional idea of how much they're getting out of the system and how much they're putting in. Because we all have a tax account, we all have a contract with our fellow citizens and the government. And of course there are reasons why some can't put in and others do. But we shouldn't allow people to forget that there is this constant juggling between ourselves about who gets what, for what purposes, and who is unable to contribute for what reasons. And I think it helps the politician, and it is a tough job balancing these different needs and requirements, but it helps the politician if voters are acutely aware of the value of what it is they receive. And when they're more aware of the value of things they receive, I think it's possible then to have a civil conversation between the givers and the receivers as to how much ought to be transferred. Thank you.
I'm a Shuswap, which is a tribe in the interior plateau of British Columbia. Our population is about 15,000 souls, which is still a fraction of what it was during traditional times. Most of my people live on what are called Indian reserves, whose title is vested in Her Majesty, meaning that the federal government owns the land over which we live. In former times, we were a trading people. We had our own economies. We had the horse before the white people came into our lands. We traded, and therefore we thrived and survived on our lands for many, many millennia. And then what happened? What happened to my people is that we were legislated out of the economy. The federal government passed what is called the Indian Act. My brother passed away in the year 2010. You would think that his family would be able to deal with his wishes. But no, that isn't the case if you're a status Indian living on a reserve. It's the Department of Indian Affairs, or Aboriginal Affairs as it's known now, to deal with his wishes, to dispose of what property he had. If I had a will right now and the Minister of Indian Affairs didn't like it, that wouldn't be surprising to me if he chose not to follow with what I wanted to do. So there have been about 7 generations of my people that have lived under the tyranny of the Indian Act. We have what is called certificates of possession over lands that we say are ours. And that's all it means, is that we have a right to possess those lands, but we have no ability to be able to go to the bank, like most of you can in this country and in Canada, get a mortgage to build a home on your own. We have no ability, because of the lack of private property rights, to pass on wealth to future generations. We have no ability to be able to put our own children through university. We can't start a business because we can't mortgage those lands. We can't be bonded. These are situations that all of you sitting in this room would never stand for. But yet we find ourselves in a situation where we're dependent on somebody that we don't want to be dependent on. So it's created this vicious cycle of dependence. And I want to change that. I want to be able to create a situation where we've got access to optional legislation that will allow our community to have a collective title over the lands that are now called Indian reserves, and in turn, individuals be granted indefeasible title based on a system that was invented here in Australia called the Torrens system. So that my people will be able to realize the value of those lands. Right now we have what is called dead capital. Yes, we can develop it through a cumbersome process of leasing through the Department of Indian Affairs. It takes anywhere from 6 to 10 times longer to develop our lands than off reserve. And it creates this incredibly complex system of asking somebody else permission for your own future, for your own destiny. And this is something that we don't want to have. We want to be able to create the kinds of institutions that Australians and Canadians have taken for granted. We want an education system where we can influence, an education to be not used as a tool, not a weapon, but as a tool for our betterment. We want to be able to create a system where we can have governance over our lands so that we can create simple things like builders' liens, standards. I sat on an advisory panel to the Auditor General of Canada for 6 years. We found that we were building disposable homes on our lands. Homes that last on average, before major repairs are needed, of 7 years. I was walking around town here over the last couple of years. I've seen structures that are 1926, the year my dad was born, 1903, 1870. You never see that kind of built structure in the majority of Indigenous communities. Why is that? It's because in my particular situation of Canada, we've been shut out of the economy. I want to break down those walls of dependence. I want to break down those walls so that we can become part of the Canadian economy and therefore the global economy. I want to be an integral part of the federation known as Canada. I'm a proud Canadian. I had uncles fight and die for Canada. I understand that we're allies. You have a similar history as Canada, similar issues, and they're not insurmountable. You know, one of the things that you've heard with the last couple of speakers is that governments have been trying to solve Indigenous issues over and over and over and over again. I'm probably just as sick of it as you folks are. Because they're trying the same solutions over and over and over again, and they'll never work. And the reason they'll never work is because governments tend to try to solve issues through a social prism. These are social problems. Let's invent a social program to deal with what is fundamentally an economic issue. The economics is that we're out of the economy. If we're a part of the economy, we can become productive citizens. We can contribute. That's ultimately what we want. So, when I talk about private property rights back home, a lot of my own people, meaning leaders of Indigenous communities in Canada, are very reluctant to go down that path because they say that is not our way. We didn't live like that. But in traditional times, if we didn't have property rights and individual home ownership, if you came into my home, you'd find out very quickly who owned it. You can't go into any community and say that one piece of clothing fits the entire village. In my culture, a moccasin is made for my feet. I've got duck feet, short, wide. It had to be made for me. Our cultures in the past were dynamic. We made significant contributions to humanity. There's nowhere in the world that you can find wild corn. I saw a shop, an outdoor sales area selling corn, cobs of corn, lots of people eating it. There's nowhere in the world you can find it wild. That was invented by my people. It was genetically engineered so that we could take a plant that you couldn't eat to be able to eat. I saw people eating, and I love it here, the potatoes, the little like fritters or whatever they're called. But potatoes, there are 4,000 varieties in Peru. We have wild potatoes as well at home. Tomatoes. All of these things we've benefited from what is called the Columbian Exchange. The exchange between the world. And we continue to benefit from that, all of us. And it's because of trade. It's because we can take one bit of something from this country, import it over here, and build something that can be marketed around the world. I love glasses. I'm a Beatles fan. What started me wearing glasses was John Lennon. And I was looking in one of the eyeglass places today, and there was a book of Steve Jobs And he was wearing these glasses that I'd love to get one day. But what Steve Jobs did was imaginative in Apple. So the most important resource we've got is between our ears, an ability to be able to imagine. And my future isn't about imagining dependence. I want to leave you with words of my hero, Chief Joseph from 1879. Let me be a free man, free to travel to Australia, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to talk, think, and act for myself. Thank you.
I'm going to be giving a historical addendum, really, to Peter's presentation. I've called it, "We Want Work, Not Welfare: How a Labour Tradition Was Subverted." The colonists who came to Australia wanted to create a better Britain. One of the British things they were determined to avoid was welfare dependency. They refused to recreate the English Poor Law. The Poor Law had operated from Elizabethan times. It was a public welfare system provided out of a local rate. The local authorities ran poorhouses and workhouses, but they also gave assistance to people still in their own homes, in the form of doles, pensions, assistance with rent, and supplements to wages, a sort of mini welfare state before the word. From the late 18th century, the cost of poor relief rose astronomically because the practice of supplementing wages became widespread and permanent in southern England. Farmers had every incentive to keep their wages low, knowing that their workers would be kept alive by payments contributed by landholders of the whole parish. In our parlance, the system was being rorted. The reforming Whig government, which took office in 1830, came to the rescue of ratepayers. It amended the Poor Law so that no able-bodied person was to receive assistance unless they entered the workhouse, where work was to be arduous and the standard of provisions lower than what the worst-paid labourer could secure outside. For the able-bodied outside, there would be no more supplements to wages, allowances for large families, or money payments of any sort. Working people were very resentful at this change. They felt that a traditional right of Englishmen to a living in his own country had been taken from them. They called the workhouses, with their studied harshness, bastilles, engines of tyranny. On some occasions, these mini bastilles were attacked by enraged workers. 19th century Australians formed their notion of a poor law from these experiences. The nightmare increase in the poor rates, so that industry and enterprise were crippled to pay them, was a powerful folk memory. Australian landowners did not want to pay a tax on land, and in particular a poor rate, whose incidence was so unpredictable and so likely to increase. Those who might need assistance were equally unwilling to be subjected to the meanness and cruelty of the new-style workhouses, which were the institutions most likely to be created if poor relief was made a charge on landowners. Generally, Australians regarded the Poor Law as symbolising what they wanted to escape in the old world. Potential ratepayers and potential inmates were united in the belief that there should be opportunity for all and no need for a poor law. Working men should have work, and those who had property should get the maximum possible return from it. But even in a new country, there was not always work for all who wanted it. Working people were encouraged to save for a rainy day, and they did. Savings banks were one of the new engines of social progress. But when savings were gone, unemployed workers might have to fall back on charity. In every suburb and country town, there were benevolent societies run by leisured ladies who visited homes and allocated payments. They operated on the principle that Peter's talked of, that there were deserving and undeserving poor. A respectable family man thrown out of work by a downturn in trade was worthy of maximum support. A feckless man who did not stick at work and drank and gambled his earnings away was much less deserving. This distinction is still pilloried by those who think welfare should be a state entitlement untrammelled by moral considerations, even though the state has now belatedly returned to it. The feckless in Australia are now to have part of their welfare payment quarantined, so they don't spend it on drink, drugs or gambling. A state that does not make this distinction literally demoralises its people, which is what the state has been doing over the last 40 years. The most telling example I know of this demoralisation is this. If you ride the trains in Melbourne without a ticket, you're subject to a very heavy fine. When you get the notice demanding that you pay the fine, at the bottom it says, if you are a drug addict, you do not have to pay. Respectable workers who were unemployed hated having to take charity. Their cry was, we want work, not charity. They demanded, usually with success, this is in the 19th century, that governments should provide work. The colonial governments had committed themselves to full employment because they ran migration schemes from Britain which promised work at high wages. The workers, those in work and those unemployed, had votes. The claim for work, not charity, elicited a broad sympathy. And governments could more readily comply because they were running large programs of public works, which they could expand or bring forward in times of unemployment. Mass unemployment could not be managed in this way. In the Depression of the 1890s, colonial governments with their own finances under extreme pressure could offer little extra work, and the unemployed in the East went to Western Australia, which was booming because of the gold discoveries. In the 1930s depression, state governments did better. At first, since charity could no longer cope, they gave out food to the unemployed. But to have tens of thousands of men and their families existing on these handouts was repugnant to the unemployed themselves and to the community at large. All the states except South Australia introduced special taxes on those still in work to provide relief work for the unemployed. The relief work was rationed. A man was allotted so many days' work a week according to the number of his dependents. The wages were below award level, but were designed so that men earned considerably more than the value of their food entitlement. It looks like, Gary, our governments were doing what you wanted to do then. The Australian commitment to work, not welfare, held up. The experts in welfare thought this was archaic. Best practice was now to run comprehensive welfare systems on a contributory basis, as the Germans had been doing since the 1880s and the British since before World War I. Then the unemployed would be eligible for an unemployment benefit. Non-Labor governments in Australia attempted to introduce comprehensive contributory systems in the 1920s and 1930s, and on both occasions they failed. Among the reasons for failure was the opposition of trade unions and the Labor Party. They did not want the workers to have to contribute to a welfare fund. They wanted the rich to pay for welfare. They particularly did not want to see the establishment of an unemployment benefit. They feared that as soon as that was in place, governments would no longer be under pressure to provide work for the unemployed. During World War II, the Labor government of Curtin and Chifley established the comprehensive welfare system that we have today, including the unemployment benefit. They followed Labor policy in paying for it out of general revenue, but they broke Labor policy in making workers pay for it. For the first time, workers had to pay income tax, and to facilitate this, PAYE was introduced. The benefit to government was this: it taxed more, ostensibly to run a welfare system, but during the war there was very little need for welfare. So taxation for welfare gave government more money to spend on the war and limited consumption on non-essentials. There was also little call on the unemployment benefit after the war, because after this war there was no slump. When Chifley left office in 1949, there were 1,200 people on the dole. It was only from the mid-70s that large-scale unemployment reappeared. The unions were right. Once there was a dole, governments were under less pressure to provide work. Unions themselves were inclined to look after members in work rather than those without. For some, the dole became a way of financing an alternative lifestyle. Dole bludging entered the language in the mid-1970s, a term rejected by Labor and that new entity, the welfare lobby. But after a generation, the phenomenon could be talked of in all quarters as welfare dependency. In the 1990s, governments began the push to get people off welfare into work, resisted all the way by the welfare lobby, which confuses a welfare payment with true well-being. The coalition was keener on this than Labor, and John Howard's work for the dole was widely accepted. Don Watson, who wrote speeches for Prime Minister Keating, had urged Keating to adopt Howard's policy of mutual obligation and failed. Watson writes that 10 minutes of talkback radio shows that the people do not want sloth to get the same reward as industry and ambition. He tried to tell Keating that he'd lose no votes by adopting something like Howard's policy, which Howard was advocating from opposition. I agree with Watson. The people's view on this principle is still sound. Governments, having abandoned it for a time, should stick with it. And even though work schemes may be more expensive than paying a dole, governments should insist on work, not welfare. Thank you.
Okay, I apologise for the state of my voice in advance, and it's been a bit of a rugged week, but if we get through it without a big hacking cough, we'll be in front. The logic of the welfare state is that material resources are unequally distributed across society and should be redistributed via government programs to promote economic well-being. Now, with regards to the protection of children from abuse and neglect, the contemporary welfare state applies a different version of the same logic. Parenting ability has also been unequally distributed across the socio-economic spectrum and must too be redistributed via government-funded support programs to promote social well-being. This is called the family support or family preservation approach to child protection, and this approach has become standard policy and practice in all Australian states and territories over the last 40 years. In child protection, as in perhaps no other policy area, egalitarian principles are misapplied, and the ideals of the welfare state run up against the realities of human nature. The state and territory community service departments that are responsible for administering child welfare laws attempt to fix problem families by constructing a vast social service system. This involves employing assorted members of the helping professions, including social workers, drug and alcohol counsellors, psychologists, and family therapists. Their job is to assist parents overcome the range of issues that impede their ability to properly parent children. The operating assumption behind these efforts is that individual character is infinitely malleable and people can be rehabilitated as desired by the visible hand of state-run social service interventions. If only this were true. Unfortunately, damaged people stay damaged and damage their children. For damaged is what most of the parents caught up in the child protection system are. Most of the families with major child safety concerns are welfare dependent and suffer multiple, chronic, and often intergenerational problems, including domestic violence, mental illness, drug and alcohol abuse, and the burdens of single parenting. These families constitute an underclass or a hardcore of families with serious and hard to resolve problems. Welfare dependence induced and exacerbated dysfunction has led to the breakdown of social norms, especially concerning the care of children. In my opinion, flawed child protection policy lies at the centre of the process by which the welfare state and its associated dependencies and dysfunctions are replicated through the generations. What happens in the name of family preservation is that children are kept with dysfunctional households at nearly all costs. Serious child welfare concerns in the most disadvantaged families end up being reported and re-reported numerous times to child protection authorities, mostly by police, education and health professionals, who are obliged to do so under mandatory reporting laws. However, the action taken in response to repeated reports is often manifestly inadequate, even when harm is assessed as imminent and even in proven cases of abuse and neglect. In too many cases, vulnerable children languish in homes in which at best their basic developmental needs are not met, while prolonged attempts are made to work with parents to address their behavioural issues. When efforts to keep families together fail, and after parents have had almost limitless opportunities to change, statutory, that is court-approved, removal and provision of alternative accommodation occurs only as a last resort and only after children have been damaged, sometimes irreparably, by exposure to parental abuse and chronic neglect. After finally being removed, children then enter so-called temporary foster care, while further efforts are made to work with parents to facilitate family reunions. Foster placements are prone to break down due to children's abuse and neglect-related emotional, psychological, and behavioural problems. When family reunions are attempted, they also frequently break down after intractable parental problems re-emerge. Children then re-enter care and are further damaged as the constant disruption of their living arrangements denies them the stable and consistent routines, the attachment with loving and trusted carers, and the educational opportunities children need to thrive. Of course, parents should be given a chance to get their acts together and be helped to do so when they first come under child protection scrutiny. But here we reach the limits of social policy and individual capacity. Reversing entrenched patterns of dysfunction and achieving lasting behavioural change in a timely manner is extremely difficult when you are dealing with dysfunctional, intergenerationally disadvantaged people whose lives are troubled and chaotic, who are poorly parented, and who are bereft of basic life skills. For this reason, Sisyphean efforts to transform dysfunctional families into functional ones need to be strictly time-limited and be based on realistic assessments of the prospects for success. It is common for episodes of care to stretch beyond 2 or 3 years, and multiple episodes mean the time spent cycling in and out of care can consume the bulk of childhood. By adolescence, the cumulative toll of instability and maltreatment creates a class of children classified as having high and complex needs, a category which covers virtually all of the over 35,000 children currently in care in Australia. High and complex is a euphemism for personal problems so severe that many highly damaged and disturbed young people are unable to live safely either with their parents or with a normal foster family due to their uncontrollable, threatening, violent and self-destructive behaviour. This sums up the madness of the current approach. Increasing numbers of damaged children are entering and remaining in care due to the misguided, protracted and often futile efforts that are made to fix unfixable families. To house the children and the teens who have been failed by the child protection services that are meant to protect them, state governments are quietly reinstitutionalising the out-of-home care system at an enormous cost. 30 years after residential orphanages were closed down, in recognition of the detrimental impact of institutional care on children's well-being, governments are reopening similar facilities. Modern-day residential facilities tend to be small-scale group homes, but they also include secure facilities, which are the modern-day asylums used to lock up disturbed teenagers whose behaviour poses a threat to themselves and to others. Adverse childhoods make for bleak future prospects. Many children graduate from the care system into lives of crime, prostitution, drug and alcohol abuse, homelessness, mental illness, jail and unemployment. They become the next generation of abusive and neglectful parents. The lifetime costs of child protection failures across the whole of government are substantial, and as the underclass expands, so does the social and economic costs of the welfare state. Breaking the intergenerational cycle of abuse and neglect is essential to contain the welfare state's scale and its destructive impact. Child protection policy in practice thus needs to acknowledge that childhood is fleeting and this period of life needs to be optimised, or else children's futures are compromised. A fundamental change of approach is called for. Children with well-founded welfare concerns need to be removed in a more timely fashion from parents who are demonstrably incapable of caring for them. The evidence, as common sense would suggest, shows that children who are removed earlier and permanently, preferably by means of adoption, have better outcomes than children who are damaged by family preservation and the removal reunion treadmill. Furthermore, with record numbers of children unable to live safely with their parents, and with the cost of the out-of-home care system rapidly rising in all jurisdictions, the only affordable and sustainable way to provide sufficient safe and stable homes is by increasing the number of children who are adopted out of care by suitable families. In Australia in 2009-10, only 61 children were adopted by non-relatives and 53 by foster carers. This was despite almost 23,000 children having been in government-funded placements continuously for more than 2 years. The reasons for negligible adoption rates is that in Australia, adoption is a taboo subject in child protection and the social services sector. Even children with a slight prospect of being safely returned home will not be made available for adoption. This is mainly due to the misguided belief that children are almost always better off with their biological parents, no matter how inadequate, a belief which borders on an ideological obsession and ignores the reality of child harm on the ground. The woolly-minded notion that removing children punishes and stigmatises poor parents trumps the hard-headed fact that not everyone is cut out to be a parent. Anti-adoption attitudes can also be partly attributed to the sensitivities surrounding stolen generations, the forgotten generation, and the forced adoption controversies, and the resulting reluctance of politicians to mandate the revival of a practice tainted by past associations. In other countries, by comparison, the taboo is weaker and attitudes to adoption are less timid and intimidated. In the United States, permanency is given greater precedence over preservation. On average in the last decade, more than 50,000 US children have been adopted every year from out of care by foster carers and others wanting to become adoptive parents. If Australian children in care were adopted at the same rate as in the United States, there would have been approximately 5,000 adoptions from care in Australia in 2009-10. In the land of the free, liberty does not extend to license to be a bad parent, and the truth that children need good and stable families to succeed on their merits is held to be self-evident. In the land of the fair go, by contrast, underclass children remain the underdogs, chained by their childhoods to the lowest rungs of society. The irony for those on the centre-right is that in this area of social policy, we need more state intervention, more court-approved removals and legal termination of parental responsibilities and freeing of children for adoption. This does not represent yet another expansion of the prerogatives of the state, anything but. It represents a return to founding liberal principles and a recalibration of the legitimate role of the state in defending those who can't defend themselves. As John Stuart Mill argued in On Liberty, parents who failed to fulfil their sacred duties towards their children were guilty of a moral crime, both against the unfortunate offspring and against society. If the parent does not fulfil this obligation, the state ought to see it fulfilled. To update Mill, instead of prioritising the so-called rights of bad parents to keep and regain custody of children, we should be protecting the rights of children to enjoy their full opportunities of their future citizenship. If the aim is to achieve welfare without the state, then both the state and families need to play a larger role in protecting the welfare of children who require assistance. Increasing the number of underclass children adopted by good families would make a concrete contribution to this project and a material difference to the size of the welfare state. Thank you.